Hi, this is Frank Chen. Welcome to the A16Z YouTube channel. In this episode, which is part 2 of a 2-part series that we created on Sandbox VR, what we're going to do is talk to the entrepreneurs, Steve Zhao and Siqi Chen, about the founding story of their company. I've long been a fan of the NPR podcast, How I Built This with Guy Raz, and I've always secretly wanted to do an episode just like it. And so here it is. We're going to go to the founding story of Sandbox VR. Who you'll see in conversation with the entrepreneurs is A16Z General Partner Andrew Chen, who led the investment and is now a board member of the company. So enjoy this look into the founding story of Sandbox VR. After they finish up the founding story, they're going to have a conversation about the future of virtual reality and storytelling, which I think you'll really enjoy, because as we create a new media, we're going to create all kinds of new genre and conventions for storytelling, and I think you'll really enjoy that part of the conversation as well. So let's drop right into the founding story of Sandbox VR. Andrew talking to Steve and Siqi, and the first thing they're going to discuss is how the two of them were inspired by the way Hollywood grew up.
I know one of the early things that we talked about, in all of this was it kind of separate from the deck was actually the motion picture Hollywood kind of analogy. Do you guys want to say a little bit about that and what aspect of that kind of inspires you?
Well, I mean, I think that's where the network effects came from, right? This idea of looking back 100 years. You have Nickelodeon starting up, and it was very bomb and pop. And over time,
Nickelodeon, not the MTV channel.
The Dime movies. And over time, you develop a studio system, and that became vertically integrated. The studios started buying up the actual cinemas, and then all of a sudden, you had the golden age Hollywood, and then in 1948, that became illegal in America through Paramount versus United States. They broke up the monopoly, and so looking at what we're trying to do is you can see a very similar path. And so you mentioned that we want to do this virtual integration stuff, and it's I think we did it because, well, actually, to be clear, Steve did it because Steve had to, right? There's no technology, so we had to build technology. There's no stores to place this technology, so you had to build a store. And there's no content, so you had to build the content. But over time, as you get scale, all of that changes.
Right. Well, I think it's fascinating, the idea that, as an industry, what we sort of seem to want to do with VR was basically invent the technology and then immediately bring it home, right, into homes. Right, and that's certainly not what happened in the film industry, because there was literally decades of content creation, just in theaters before we actually got, movies actually playing on people's TVs, right? So I think that's a really interesting, metaphor as well. So yeah, what other during your fundraising process on this, I'm curious, what other objections did you hear from people? What were other kind of risk points that people kind of pointed out, along the way?
So we started fundraising in Hong Kong, went to China, Japan before we went to Silicon Valley, and one of the biggest challenges was it was a disconnect of what they envisioned what we had versus what we actually had, right? We didn't have a store in Japan, so they weren't able to actually try out. Their perception of VR was what they've seen in home. And it's something that we've noticed is because once we take them to our location and we see the expressions on the face, and even people would actually tell us I can't believe that's possible.
Yeah, that was my experience. I joined last year because I was an early investor in the company, and Steve told me to launch it. I didn't care about any of it.
Right.
And I tried it. Right. I think that's the big difference.
And maybe we can get really detailed into the differences specifically, right? So because you're using, Oculus in some places, you're using HTC Vive. So what's actually different about the experience? So you go to a location,
yes,
right? And you go usually with how many people?
Up to 6.
Up to 6 people. Okay. Yeah. And then talk to us about just before you even get into the games, into the experience. you know, what is the experience kind of, you know, before that?
Yeah, so you check in. Our staff welcomes you. They start gearing you up with these markers. And so all of us already, there's a sense of, oh, this is different.
Right.
And I didn't know what I was coming into. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm wearing these markers. I'm not sure what they're for.
Right.
You walk into a room, and the first impression of the room is like, this looks like a CGI motion capture studio because it's a complete green screen. So that was exciting. Then you get geared up with haptic vests, and then a computer, and then a headset. And then the experience gets turned on.
Right.
And so you go from seeing nothing to you and all of your friends, they're there, but virtually as someone different, or in this training room case, like an empty blue avatar.
Right.
And now that's the place where everyone starts screaming. I mean, you're high-fiving people, you're shaking their hand, you're like, it's like, this is crazy. And I think
because it's super interesting that you know, the thing I remember the first time I used it was that first, when you get all the gear up and running, you like kind of look pretty badass, right? Like you have like this vest, like it's all black, like you actually kind of feel pretty badass. You see kind of on one of the walls, there's a bunch of you know, different guns and different props. And it kind of looks like that scene in The Matrix where you know, where they like hit the button, you know, and then like all the guns come out and it's just like a wall of, you know, it sort of like looks reminiscent. You're just like, wow, that's like pretty cool.
That's true. Walking into the room and seeing a rack full of equipment was a magic moment as well.
Right, right. And then you're saying like, so clarify, like what does it mean that you high five like in the game and in the, like what do you mean by that exactly?
I mean, you know, I can see you with your body tracked correctly, and when we high five each other in the VR game, like we
physically also
are like doing that, and it actually works. And so if you're used to a home VR where you can't touch anything, or it's all virtual, that is for me was a mind-blowing moment. Like, wow, okay, so now, you know, my imagination at the time was running is like, okay, I can now become anything.
Right.
And I think for me, when I thought about the differences in terms of creative possibilities, is like, if you think about content and a home VR, the focus is around where you get to be and sort of this story and this world around you. But because of the limitations of the hardware and experience, not enough of it was about who you get to be.
Right.
And I think that, more than anything, is like a big differentiator for our content. It's like that sense of embodiment and social.
So going back to the investor reactions to, you know, this kind of during your seed round, kind of before Andreessen Horowitz, and also during your pitch, like what were some of the other kind of points of feedback, you know, that you got from people that, you know, go ahead.
Well, we started really early, so I guess it's kind of like a founding story in a sense. So I started this company in Hong Kong because I was building my last company in Hong Kong, and VR came about. You know, we were all very excited, so we wanted to work in VR. But we approached it differently as game developers. Was like, what was the end experience that we wanted to create? And we saw consumer VR, and we thought there was something about it that didn't feel right. Right? In VR, we wanted to be essentially the holodeck or getting plugged into the matrix. So I went to my team and we thought, hey, can we build something like that? And then what would it take to build something like that? And then we realized you need a retail space, you need your own content, and you need the technology. And we raised about $500,000 in the beginning. And we thought, well, the Void has about much more than that, multiples of that. I think it's a worthwhile bet.
Yeah, I put in 1,000 of that.
So we had a lot of help from Siqi as well in the beginning.
$1,000 of help from Siqi.
I'll spend it all in one place.
Right.
Yeah, so that lasted us quite a while. So that was the bet. But at the same time, the investors, friends who basically pitched in, they felt that, well, it's early, we should build a title as well. So that's what we did. We built a title, and we also worked on the holodeck. So my thinking was, you know, by the time...
Built a title meaning?
A consumer title for the Oculus and for Steam.
Right, right. Just for in-home VR?
For in-home VR.
Okay, got it. Right. So this is sort of like a two separate bets. One was just, let's just try to do something for in-home VR. Mm-hmm. Also, this sort of full stack strategy.
That's right.
As well, right.
So we're thinking that by the time that we're done with the title, the revenue that we'll be making from the title would hopefully break even on just that title, and we can hedge everything onto the HOLODECK. But that was Christmas of 2016, and when we launched it, based on Steam data, we were the top 20% selling game, but we lost over 90% on that title. There were just not enough users playing it. And we were, there was a very harsh reality that company was going to run out of money, and it was going to run out of money very soon. So what we did, going back to your questions, was we needed to raise a seed round as soon as possible. So at that time, we had the core technology where friends could actually high-five each other, right? Multiple users. It was really cool. And then
could you say a little bit about the team right at that point was based in Hong Kong. How many folks were on the team?
There were 6 people, including me.
Right. Okay. Great.
So we had 1 engineer that just focused on building the HOLODECK, 2 engineers that built the content, and then 1 artist, and another individual and me. So, we had investors came in to try out the demo, and they were playing around with it. They're like, this is the beginning of 2017 when VR was starting to not be as hot, right? And they're looking at what we're trying to do, and it is a very big thing to both have a physical store, your own content, and to flesh out the technology. So we couldn't get investors interested. We talked to many of them, and they wouldn't even write back. I guess they just couldn't really think this would be a viable business. So what I did at that point was we had 1 month of runway, and I sat down with my team, and I told them, look guys, this company's gonna be gone in a month, and I think it's a shame because I believe that the HOLODECK should exist. It's just unfortunate that it won't be us and someone else will be able to solve it. So at that time, I still have a nest egg saved up, working at Blue Tea for the last 10 years. And I actually told the team, I can invest everything into this. And by the way, I ran it by my friends and my family, and everyone's like, Steve, don't be stupid. Just get a normal job. Don't use all your money into this company again.
Yeah, that was me.
Yep.
Yeah, I told him that.
So
strongly.
There's a lot, it's very logical. It's very logical. It was a really risky bet, but I didn't feel like giving up at that time. I felt like we should have 1 more shot, right?
Right.
So,
and just to be clear, so this was your basically life savings that you had accumulated over the course of your previous, game studio company.
That's right.
And so this would have been like, this is like a real bet for you.
Yeah, it's a real bet. It's a real bet for me. I felt like it was also a real bet for my team as well, because they came into the company where they reduced the salary by half and then half, and they still stuck on.
Right.
So we sat down. It was very real. We were very discouraged. But I said, here, we can do 6 more months. But back then we wanted to just build a demo in 6 months. And I told them we don't have the luxury anymore, right? We can't convince investors. We must convince the market. So we need to get to market by 6 months. And I told them, look, in order for this to work, we all must say yes to this. So I remember that day, we all sat down and each of us raised our hand, and we said, okay, 6 months, let's make this happen. So that was pretty much the foundation of how this actually became an actual product. So we worked pretty much nonstop for 7 days a week, and we built the product in about 4 months, and we opened in late June. And at that time, we found a location which we needed some place that was relatively cheap in rent. So we found this high-rise in Hong Kong where there's absolutely no foot traffic. In fact, it was in a high-rise where people don't want to be seen. There's a lot of membership clubs there. So it was a great space. It was cheap. So we located on the 16th floor, and we pretty much just waited. We had people came in and played. We have, we had some news agency that talked about us. But what happened was over time, people started, sharing our product, and then one of the social media channel got the news picked up, and then everyone started sharing it, and then people started booking. I remember one afternoon, the phone wouldn't stop ringing for 4 hours straight.
Right.
And then that's when we thought, maybe we can actually make this work.
Right.
So that was just the beginning of the story.
That's awesome. Okay, and it makes me think even the green room, right? For all of us that have gone to like Museum of Ice Cream, you know, where you go in and you're just like, it's just bright colors and you're just taking photos. You know, whenever I've been to, you know, one of the Sandbox VR, you know, locations, people start taking selfies from like almost the very beginning, right? Because it's basically like as soon as they can, they're like, oh man, I like look cool. I have these like, you know, all this gear on. I'm in this like green room. It has this sort of like otherworldly feel, you know, from you know, basically the first minute.
That's right.
And then obviously, as you were saying, it like you're able to generate you know, some of the in-game footage as well, which is really interesting. But I wouldn't even downplay the fact that like people just start doing it, you know, by themselves, like you know, pretty much right away.
What did you call it? An aggressive Starbucks?
Oh, it's the store design?
Yeah.
Well, that's where we want to go, right? But I think, yeah, I don't think that's what we have. At least that certainly wasn't the first store, right? The first one was very rundown, shabby Starbucks.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think, you know, certainly like the green screen, the green room is kind of a stroke of genius, right? You come in and all of these memories and associations of every time you see Benedict Cumberbatch pretend to be a dragon, right? Like they're filming in this stage, or when they're filming Lord of the Rings, all this behind the scenes stuff, you're like, oh wow, now I'm one of them. So it already puts you in that mood, and then once the experience starts, yeah, it was a good setup.
Right, it makes you feel like a star, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it does.
That's, you know, that's kind of what you're saying.
That's right.
That's great. And then talk to us about the seed round. So, you know, in the seed round, you raised it, you know, with the entire team in Hong Kong, you know, kind of really early. You know, what was the reaction there? And I know in Asia there's a little bit, there's some precedent because there are a lot of kind of VR arcades. There's a lot of kind of like location-based entertainment already, you know, kind of happening. So, you know, how much did that play into it? And like talk to us about sort of the group of investors that you were trying to put together for the seed round.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first started to start pitching with investors, now that we have traction in the stores, the first question was, so what is your VR and how is it different from all the other VRs I've been experiencing? So it was just first, well, why don't you try it out and play it? And I think the product essentially sells itself. And I remembered Alibaba Hong Kong Entrepreneurs Fund led our round, and the lead investor, he told me that, look, I try a lot of VR, I get motion sick. So I don't think it's gonna be different with yours. And you know, I told him, well, if you get motion sick in our VR, don't invest in us, right? And he came. And then when he was done, he's like, that just felt like real life. He played it through and he wanted to play again, actually.
Right.
So I think that was the really core thing, was just to let them try the product.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And Siqi, in your case, this was something where at this point you were at Postmates.
Yep.
Actually, why don't you say a little bit about what you were doing at Postmates and kind of hearing about the idea yourself, and you know, and you were initially an investor. So yeah, let's talk about all that.
Yeah. You know, you go back to the founding of it. Steve described it as sort of escape rooms with VR, and I told him that is the dumbest pitch I've ever heard. Like, I don't get it.
Still did it anyway.
Still did it anyway. I don't know. Like, yeah, there's so many dumb ideas that Steve had. It turns out to be not dumb. Yeah. So I was at Postmates when this thing was launched. He calls me, and I thought, all right, I didn't know the company was going anywhere. And he says, hey, we're sold out for the next 6 months. Brilliant. Okay, cool. Still didn't care, right? Because in my head, in my mind at the time when I heard that, it was like, you do a VR thing in Hong Kong, 8 million people, high density, maybe we're going to try it just because it's VR. And so, yeah, in August, year and a half ago, right, went to Hong Kong, tried it myself, and that's the thing that convinced me. Like, you know, over and over again, we know that this doesn't make sense unless you try it and you get it. None of this makes sense unless you try it. And what I experienced was, yeah, this is like the first version of the thing I've been dreaming about since I was in high school, which is the holodeck.
Right.
And to have done it with 6 people, like in Hong Kong, with no money, and have it be a working business, and have a AAA piece of content that was 30 minutes long, that was super high quality, done in like less than half a year, like, you know, honestly, you give me millions of dollars and you give me 2 years, and there's no way I would have done that. So it's like almost, another thing was like, okay, this team isn't afraid to do crazy things, and it's efficient in a way that like it's not possible to do here.
Right. And then a funny side part of the story is that you and I talked about the seed round.
That's right. We
Because
did.
I was at Uber at the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
with
so,
you were with someone, right? You were working with someone.
Yes, yeah. So my friend Bubba Miorka.
Bubba, that's right.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
We were looking at companies together. And I was like, okay, Siqi. So, all right, buddy. I was like, I haven't met the CEO. I haven't had the experience. You're excited about it, right? But I'm kind of like, how can I possibly invest in something without seeing it?
I don't blame you.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is great, right? I mean, to be involved, a few years later from that. So I think I remember at that point, I had also known of some of the other folks that were in the industry, other location-based players. It wasn't clear, like, okay, as an angel investor at the time, do you invest in the big guys that maybe had raised a whole bunch of money and this and that, or is this the team? And by the way, they're also in Asia, and like, are they going to do anything in the U.S.? How easily will these ideas translate into the U.S.? And so I passed on the on the seed round, which is a really interesting place to start the whole conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew.
A lot of people did. Yeah.
I didn't have $1,000 laying around to
Could have used that.
Yeah. It wasn't the easiest seed round, and it wasn't the easiest A for those reasons. Yeah,
right.
You have to try it.
Yeah.
And even if we're getting into, now we're getting into the story of A, but we thought we would start in Asia because we have a location ready to go in Asia. And even Asian-based investors, they don't even want to go to Hong Kong. Like, it's weird. They're in Singapore, they're in mainland, but like, oh, we have one in Hong Kong, and people didn't want to go.
Right.
A lot of people ended up regretting it, but like,
Right.
it was difficult.
Right. The location-based aspect of it, the fact that it's so experiential.
Yep.
Right. Those are the things that are actually so strong about this.
Yep.
But if you decide that you're not gonna worry about it, then then off you go. Let's talk a little bit about the Series A, raise and some of the feedback that you guys got along the way also. So I think maybe I'll just share my experience, on the whole thing. I think one of the fascinating parts about raising the Series A was you guys came into town, we had dinner, right? We went to Avery.
Avery, great restaurant, by the way.
Which is an amazing restaurant. Love it. And
You're
then
welcome, Ronnie.
and what happened was, and then you guys got the location running. And then I remember the first week that it was open, it was basically like in my social media feeds, like nonstop. And then I think you told me like 4 days in that you guys had already gotten a term sheet.
Yeah.
Right. And so so just talk to us about that experience. Like this, the investment opportunity became white hot. Basically, it started from zero and then became white hot immediately. And so like how did that work?
Well, I think there's two parts to it. One part is the amount of diligence and preparation needed for Series A, and although pretty much most of the credit goes to Siqi for that, in terms of how he can strategize on getting investors to group up together, how he can kind of pace out the investor, who goes first, who goes next.
It's just much easier with a product that is awesome.
So, so that in itself is really important. How we think about the deck, how we think about the story. Like Siqi, he has a really good way of structuring that. And the second part is just having him come to our store, right, and just getting it to be opened in time for the investors to be there.
Yeah. So we signed a term sheet in June. We kicked off the fundraising process internally late January, just in terms of preparation. Right, so we have a CODA database of, I think, it ended up being over 400 investors, and we went through everyone who has ever invested in any kind of game or VR or entertainment or media.
Right.
And so we went on Crunchbase, and then we filtered down by check size, who could intro us, with the right stage, then by geo, and we, I believe fundraising is about supply and demand, and you want to minimize your supply and concentrate your demand in time and space. So we try to do that. Asia, the network wasn't as good and people were willing to come. So, luckily I've been in the Bay Area for 10 years, right? So once we had the store up, it was just outreach to a bunch of people.
Right.
People started. It wasn't actually. We didn't actually. To be quite honest, like we weren't trying to saturate the social feed.
Right.
We just wanted people to come.
Right.
The people ended up sharing it, and then it became a little bit of a status symbol to have that on your, to have that to share, and people started like, I want one of those too. And then you know, we pitched. What's funny is like when we first started the fundraising process in the Valley. We met with a few investors, friends, you were one of them, and some other people, and we went through the deck thinking it would be friendly, and it was, right? They were still friends, but the store wasn't ready, and so on that basis, we were already dismissed. And then, of course, once you try it, you're like, okay, never mind. But yeah, so it was just a lot of preparation and like making sure we concentrate as many meetings as we can in a very small amount of time.
Right. Well, awesome. And you know, I think the part of the part of this that's my story is basically, you know, once you have the location up and running, you had a term sheet within a couple days. We visited, you know, 1 or 2 days after that over the weekend. Had you guys in on a Monday, and then my part of the story, which was really fun, was I was like, well, I have to go see all the other, you know, location-based entertainment products right out there. And so, so I booked a flight to Vegas the day that you guys had come in and done the formal, you know, presentation to us. Went to Vegas, tried out a bunch of things, and then on the flight back at the airport was like texting with you guys to set up time, you know, to meet up, because I got convinced, and I think this part was really interesting too. I was convinced actually because I tried a couple different experiences. And it wasn't that, you know, necessarily that the experiences were, you know, from a technology standpoint or from a content standpoint, you know, those weren't actually even the comparison points. I actually just felt like there's a lot of people trying to do something that looks more like sort of this passive experience, almost like film storytelling kind of a thing, and that the Sandbox experience was actually the most like a game, and that I'll bet on something interactive any day, because that's how you get the frequency, that's how you get, you know, in terms of all of our, you know, interest in everything from, you know, esports and streaming and so on, that you sort of need actually ultimately games DNA to get replayability. And so the fact that both of you guys have, you know, games DNA as opposed to Hollywood DNA was actually a really key part of the investment thesis. And so after that, you know, after seeing all, you know, kind of a couple different other data points, you know, other products, then, you know, we met up that later that evening. I think we met up at like 9 or 10 p.m. We went to an In-N-Out right next to SFO, so the Millbrae one, which was packed. It was actually completely packed, and we were like the weirdos with, you know, with the laptops out, you know, and talking and like sketching things on napkins, and we're doing spreadsheets and we're doing all this other stuff to try to get to a, you know, to try to wrap things up. And we got to a conclusion, and then, you know, kind of went from there, which is great. And so and obviously parts of that story are on the internet now, and part of the TechCrunch, you know, article, you know, about the investment. I want to actually, you know, pivot the conversation to you know, a different aspect of this, which is, in many ways, what you guys have done, what Sandbox has done, is to take something that is actually kind of like a minimum viable product in many ways, right? It's sort of like the, you know, I think, you know, we're up to 3 games now, right? But, you know, originally all the demos, everything that you guys were doing was primarily off of Deadwood Mansion. Which was a game that took a couple, you know, like a couple months and, you know, a small amount of money, you know, and you know, as you were describing, you know, putting on the markers, you know, you have these like motion capture balls attached to this like Velcro that you're putting around your wrists and all this other stuff, and that's where it is right now, right? But you know, that and the holodeck are kind of like, you know, there's a long way to go before we can get to like Star Trek holodeck for real, right? And so let's talk about some of the technology things that need to happen, whether it's things that, you know, are you know, within the control of the company, things that are you know, part of the ecosystem, in order to get to like the highest expressiveness that you can get in the VR medium?
I think about it in two components, right? One is like the sheer immersive quality of it, right? So, I mentioned we went through the deck, and things are just going to get better from the hardware side. But then there's like the kind of technology that we can invest in, and the other axis is how do we double down on what makes us different, which is social. So, for example, the fact that we can interact with each other, and I can touch like Steve's shoulder and shake his hand, and I'll have that work is critical to the experience, right? If you think about some other experiences, the focus has been on what you can touch in terms of a physical prop, like a table. And our belief is that the more interesting prop to touch may be your friend, is to work together. And because we can capture your body, we can also get a sense of her body language. And so if we double down on that, then how do we go from body language, which is like really granular, to emotion, right? Like, I'm looking at you, there's eye contact, you just smiled. How do we communicate all of these nonverbal things inside VR, right? And you're wearing a headset, and we don't have a camera on you. We can't motion capture your entire face yet without putting an iPhone. So how do we make that happen? And there's a lot of technology, like there is a deep learning component that will make that happen. And those are the areas that we want to invest in, so that when you're in that experience with your friends, you can actually communicate both verbally from the audio cues, but non-verbally as well. We think that's going to be big. So yeah, there's core technology, and there's just social investment. Those are the two areas that we're pretty focused on.
Right. Yeah, it seems like one of the big things is how do you increase the expressiveness of the medium while minimizing the amount of hardware that you actually have to wear, as part of it, right?
That's right.
And I know that, for instance, if you want to do really accurate tracking of your posture, of your fingertips, of facial expressions, right? This actually goes into this whole computer vision, machine learning kind of set of technologies that, again, like 10 years ago, there was not this level of richness in the industry, focused on driving that.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of the software, right? So like, how do we take everything we know about you, the pose of your body, the location of your fingers, and what you say, and translate that to expression. And so that's something we're really excited about doing.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the kinds of experiences that can be built. So today what you have is you sort of have 3 games. You have Deadwood Mansion, which is sort of a zombie. You're a soldier inside of a inside of a mansion with zombies attacking you. You have you have a pirate themed game. You also have the new one, Amber Sky, which is focused on you're an android, and you're on a space. It's a really cool experience. It's 3 shooters, right? It sort of reminds me of the era in Hollywood, which everything was like a spaghetti western.
Yeah.
And that was like what everyone was. It was all just John Wayne, and it was sort of the I forget the Italian director. Where like that's all he did, right? And this is there's one genre. And then over time, we in film, we've also seen, you get the rom-com, you get the period drama, you have all these kind of new genres of different things. So right now we're in shooters, right? Like, what are some of the other experiences that you might imagine actually facilitating that might surprise us in the future?
There's the near-term experiences, and there's a far off, right? So for the near terms, we are moving away from using guns. Actually, our next one, you'll be using different props that will be non-shooting related. So that would come out as soon as this summer. So from there, we're building other experiences where we think about more about embodiment, actually. Who do you get to be? And based on who you get to be, what type of tools will be most native to your character and your friends, right? So that's how we see in terms of near term. And you're right, we are looking into genre that extends beyond just the zombie, the pirate monster, things like that. We think of it just like how we used to build games. What type of other mainstream experiences we feel like that can cater to a wider range of audience. So that's kind of the near term. And I think about the far term as right now, a group of player plays that's inside a room of 6. What does it mean one day to build these retail spaces where there's no walls, right? You're talking about perhaps dozens, if not hundreds, of people playing at the same time. There could be immersive actors there as well. So that part is very exciting because what we have as a product is always evolving, right? We think of it as what type of limits can we remove in the future, and from those limits that we remove, what type of experiences can we create that we think people would love.
Right. That's great. Yeah, and I know, I mean, even in the games industry itself, it's like we're discovering still to this day new formats, right? It's like now all of a sudden like this battle royale format in the last couple years, right, through PUBG and then now Fortnite, of course. Now it's sort of like every game needs to explore whether or not there should be a battle royale format. So it sort of feels like this is incredibly early in the whole thing, and and again going back to the film analogy, like even learning how to tell the stories, in film, and learning like the close-up shot and the shots of like looking up at the sky, like these are all things that had to actually be invented in order to tell the story. So it just feels incredibly early. Do you guys have any genres that you feel like are your own personal like favorites that you'd love to figure out, like what is the VR kind of equivalent of that?
But I guess like just going back and riffing on what we were talking about with movies a bit. I mean, I think we're even earlier than the Westerns. Like I think this is the silent film era, right? Like what we have. Let's be real. Like they're fun. I think I can honestly claim they're the most fun thing you can have, but extremely low production value, right? And so, and just like early movies were, right? And I think that'll increase. But like I feel like I was sort of insecure about this idea that we're mostly shooters and games for a long time, and there's still a little bit of that. But recently I've come to like believe that, as you did, I think during the pitch, is like it's actually an enormous advantage, right? Because the analogy to use to create the content is enormously important, right? So if your analogy is movies, then it's going to be about movies plus, immersion, story, passive, and we care about all those things, but because of the nature of the medium that is interactive and where consequences matter and agency matters, you need to take all of the know-how from games, which are all about that, and combine that with movies, and the realization is it is a brand new medium, and the analogy of games is perhaps a better starting point than just purely movies. And it's where games have evolved to, right? If you look at Red Dead Redemption, right, that is as much of a narrative experience as a game, and I think that's the right analogy for us, and that's how we think about content. So we have shooters, and we're going to have all kinds of content, whether it's like esports, competitive narrative experiences, dance experiences, or even like training experiences, right? It's less about whether it's games or a specific piece of content, but for me, it's more about this medium as a whole that feels something different than VR as we commonly understand it. It's this new combination of movies and games that hasn't existed in the world. And that format is what this company, I think, is about.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode and letting me channel my inner Guy Raz. It's always fun to hear the founding story of companies, and boy, talk about courage, putting your entire life savings into the company. And then I love how Steve thought that was just a terrible idea, but eventually had a conversion experience and ended up joining the company. So if you liked what you saw, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty of other content planned for you. And we've got a comment thread open. So what inspired you, what surprised you as you heard the story of Sandbox VR? Go ahead and leave your comments, and we'll see you next episode.